We had made it out of the tomb, but looking at the dying boy and the endless, hostile forests surrounding us, I realized our ordeal wasn't over. It had just entered into a new, more desperate circle of hell. The pale winter sun hung like a dead eye in the overcast sky, casting no warmth on the 5 men huddled in the shadow of the culvert. 3 hours had passed since we'd crawled from the serpent's gut, and in that time, the terrible mathematics of our situation had crystallized with brutal clarity. Dimitri was dying, and we were lost. I knelt beside the boy, forcing myself to look at what Pyotr had unwrapped. The wound was a horror show of torn flesh and blackened blood, but it was the angry red inflammation creeping outward from the bullet hole that made my throat constrict. The skin had taken on a sickly, mottled appearance, and the smell, sweet, putrid, unmistakable, rose from the wound like the breath of death itself. "How long?" I whispered to Pyotr, keeping my voice low enough that Dimitri couldn't hear over his own labored breathing. The young medic's hands trembled as he rewrapped the festering wound. His face was pale, drawn with exhaustion, and something worse, the knowledge of his own helplessness. Without proper medical attention, a day, maybe 2 if we're lucky. But Sergeant, he paused, swallowing hard. If the infection reaches his bloodstream, it could be hours. Hours. The word hit me like a physical blow. I looked around at what remained of my command. Ivan sat with his broad back against a fallen pine, his massive frame somehow diminished by the ordeal we'd endured. His uniform was still damp from the pipe, frozen stiff in places, and I could see the toll our escape had taken on him. The Siberian giant, who had seemed indestructible, now looked mortal, vulnerable. Vasily had positioned himself at the edge of our meager shelter, the DP-28 ready, his weathered face scanning the tree line with the methodical patience of a veteran. Good. At least someone was maintaining proper watch. But even he couldn't hide the exhaustion in his movements, the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of a man pushed beyond his limits. And then there was the absence, the empty space where Kostya should have been. The old sniper's missing presence felt like a wound in my chest. 8 months we'd served together. I'd watched him pick off German officers with the patience of a hunter and the precision of a master craftsman. Now he was probably feeding the crows in that frozen forest behind us, his sacrifice buying us these precious hours of borrowed time. The guilt was a constant ache, sharper than the pain in my ribs, deeper than the exhaustion that threatened to drag me down. I had ordered him to cover our retreat. I had sent him to his death as surely as if I'd put a bullet in his brain myself. "Sergeant," Dimitri's voice was barely a whisper, weak and thready, but it cut through my dark thoughts. I can't feel my leg." I moved to his side, placing my hand on his forehead. The fever burned through his skin like fire, yet his body shook with violent chills. His eyes had that glassy, unfocused look of delirium creeping in at the edges of consciousness. "Easy, boy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, paternal. "You're going to be fine. We'll get you to a field hospital soon." The lie tasted like ash in my mouth.
We were at least 30 kilometers behind enemy lines, with no radio, no maps, and no clear idea of where our own forces might be. The German spearhead we'd encountered was likely the vanguard of a major offensive, which meant the front lines were fluid, chaotic. Even if we could determine which direction to travel, we'd be moving through territory crawling with Wehrmacht patrols, SS units, and local collaborators who turn us in for a handful of cigarettes and a pat on the head.
But the hardest truth was one that sat in my chest like a stone. We couldn't carry Dimitri much further, not in his condition, not with the infection spreading through his body like poison through water. Sarge, Vasily's voice was barely audible, but the tension in it made me look up immediately. He was pointing toward the distant ridge, perhaps 2 kilometers to the northeast. Movement. Looks like a patrol. I crawled up beside him, squinting against the flat winter light. At first, I saw nothing but the endless expanse of snow and dark pine. Then, like wraiths materializing from the landscape itself, I spotted them. 6 figures moving in a loose formation along the ridgeline. Even at this distance, their silhouettes were unmistakably German. The distinctive coal scuttle helmets, the way they carried their weapons, the disciplined spacing of their formation. They're following the ridge east, I observed, tracking their movement, not heading directly toward us. For now, Vasily replied grimly. But if they're part of a sweep pattern... He didn't need to finish the thought. If the Germans were conducting a systematic search of the area, it was only a matter of time before they found us. Our current position offered concealment from casual observation, but no real defensive advantage. If we were discovered here, we'd be fish in a barrel. I slid back down to where the others waited, my mind racing through possibilities. All of them were grim. We had limited ammunition, 1 wounded man who couldn't walk, and we were deep in enemy territory with winter closing in. The temperature was dropping as the day wore on, and none of us were properly equipped for a prolonged exposure to the elements. "We need to move," I announced quietly. "There's a German patrol on the eastern ridge. If they're sweeping the area systematically, this position is compromised." "What about Dimitri?" Pyotr asked, his voice strained with exhaustion and worry. I looked at the wounded boy, who had drifted into an uneasy sleep. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and even unconscious. His face was twisted with pain. In the gray afternoon light, he looked like a photograph of the dead. Too pale, too still, already more ghost than man. "We carry him," I said finally, the words coming out harder than I'd intended. "Ivan, you and Vasily will alternate on stretcher duty. Pyotr, you stay close to monitor his condition. I'll take point." "Sarge," Ivan's voice was unusually soft, almost gentle. It was a tone I'd never heard from the big Siberian before. "Maybe we should consider..." "Consider what?" I snapped, though I knew exactly what he was suggesting. The unspoken thought that had been hanging over us like a sword since we'd seen the wound. The giant's pale blue eyes were kind but hard, the eyes of a man who had seen too much death to be sentimental about it. "You know what I'm talking about. The boy's dying anyway. If we're captured because we can't move fast enough, we all die. And for what? To watch him suffer for another day or 2. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. I wanted to be angry with Ivan, to rage at him for even suggesting such a thing. But the terrible truth was that he was right. From a purely tactical standpoint, Dimitri was dead weight. Carrying him would slow us down, make us vulnerable, leave a blood trail that even a half-blind tracker could follow. It might doom us all. But there was another truth, one that cut deeper than tactical considerations. "He's 19 years old," I said quietly, looking around at the faces of my men. "Same age as my brother Mikhail when he died at Stalingrad. I held his hand while he bled out in a shell crater, watched the light go out of his eyes. I promised him I'd make it home, that I'd tell our mother how bravely he fought, how he died like a hero." I paused, feeling the weight of memory, the burden of promises made to the dying. I never made it home, never got to keep that promise. But I swore that if I ever had another chance, I wouldn't abandon a wounded comrade. Not again. The silence that followed was profound. Dimitri's labored breathing. I could see the conflict in their eyes, the understanding of survival mathematics warring with something deeper, more fundamental. "I know the odds," I continued. "I know carrying him puts us all at risk. But I also know that I have to be able to look at myself in a mirror if I survive this war. And I can't do that if I leave a 19-year-old boy to die alone in the snow like a dog." Vasily was the first to speak, his voice rough with emotion. "The sergeant's right. We don't abandon our own. That's what separates us from the fascist bastards." Ivan nodded slowly, though I could see the doubt still lingering in his expression. "Then we'd better find a way to move him without painting a blood trail across half of Poland." Pyotr was already working on the problem, tearing strips from his own undershirt to create additional bandages. "I can pack the wound better, use some of this birch bark as a compress. It won't stop the infection, but it might slow the bleeding." As my men worked to prepare Dimitri for transport, I climbed back up to observe the German patrol. They had moved further east, but what I saw beyond them made my blood run cold. Smoke was rising from what looked like a village or farmstead in the distance. Either the Germans were systematically destroying buildings to deny us shelter, or they were clearing the area of civilians who might aid Soviet forces. Either way, it meant our options for finding help were evaporating like morning mist. I was about to slide back down when movement caught my eye. Much closer this time. Perhaps 600 meters to the north, another patrol was working its way through the valley floor, and this one was heading directly toward our position. "Pack it up," I hissed down to the others. "We've got company coming. Close." The next few minutes were a blur of desperate, silent activity. We fashioned a crude stretcher from pine branches and strips of cloth torn from our greatcoats. Carefully, gently, we lifted the semi-conscious Dimitri onto it. The boy stirred as we moved him, his eyes fluttering open like a dreamer fighting to wake from a nightmare. "Mama," he whispered, his voice small and lost, the voice of a child crying out in the dark. "Easy, son," I said, squeezing his shoulder. "We're going to get you home. I promise." Another lie, but what else could I say? That we were 5 desperate men carrying a dying boy through enemy territory. with no plan beyond staying alive for the next few hours. That home was a dream, a memory, something that might not even exist anymore. As we prepared to move out, I took one last look at our temporary refuge. The culvert entrance was already disappearing behind us, swallowed by the forest. In a few hours, the Germans would probably find it, examine the signs of our passage, and resume their hunt with renewed vigor.
"Which way, Sarge?" Vasily asked, adjusting his grip on the makeshift stretcher.
I studied the terrain, weighing our pathetic options. To the east lay the patrol we'd first spotted. To the north, the approaching patrol that had forced us to abandon our position. West would take us deeper behind enemy lines, further from any hope of reaching Soviet forces. That left south, toward the dense section of old-growth forest that might offer better concealment.
South, I decided. We head for those thick woods and find a place to hole up until dark. Then we figure out our next move.
As we began our painful journey across the snow-covered ground, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake. Every step left tracks that a blind man could follow. Every minute we spent exposed in the open was a minute closer to discovery. And with each labored breath from Dimitri, each soft moan of pain, the weight of command pressed down on me like the earth above that cursed pipe.
But as I watched my men, Ivan and Vasily sharing the stretcher duty without complaint, Pyotr staying close to monitor his patient, all of them risking their lives for a boy who might not see another sunrise, I felt something else alongside the fear and doubt.
Pride. Fierce, stubborn pride. We were soldiers, sons of the motherland, and we didn't abandon our own. Even here, in this frozen hell behind enemy lines, we held on to that truth like a lifeline.
It might be enough to keep us human, even if it wasn't enough to keep us alive.
The forest loomed ahead, dark and forbidding, but promising shelter from the hunters that stalked us across the winter landscape. Behind us, our tracks in the snow told the story of our passage. 5 men and their wounded comrade, moving deeper into the unknown, carrying their dying friend toward an uncertain fate.
In the distance, carried on the wind, I could hear the faint but unmistakable sound of dogs barking.
The hunt was about to begin in earnest.